Right, this is Applied Psychology BTEC. This is the content for Unit 3, content area C2, where we're looking at treatment and management of addiction and stress. And in this particular lesson, we're still looking at physical ways to manage stress, and this particular one is about stress inoculation training. And what this basically is it's an adapted version of cognitive behavioural therapy, which is designed specifically to target stress. So if you remember, cognitive behavioural therapy has two basic elements. Cognitive, where we're looking at changing or adapting the way we think from being perhaps a more negative way of thinking to changing that to be more positive. And then behavioural. The behavioural element of cognitive behavioural therapy is where we're trying to change behaviour to be more positive. So for stress inoculation training, you'd have probably roughly similar to what you'd have with CBT, something like 9 to 12 sessions over 2 or 3 months, and the sessions would be like around an hour, perhaps slightly longer. So let's talk about what's involved. There's 3 phases to stress inoculation training. Firstly, cognitive preparation, secondly, skill acquisition, and thirdly, application and follow through. And you'll see as we go through this that this has got some, or in fact quite a lot of similarity to when we talked about cognitive behavioural therapy and the sorts of things that are involved in that. So it is cognitive behavioural therapy, it's just a very specific version of it. And the idea is that you're basically preventing or protecting someone, that's why it's called inoculation. You're protecting someone against future stress by giving them the tools that they need in order to combat it. And these 3 phases, you will largely move through them in that order, but people will move backwards and forwards as needed within that process. Okay, so the first phase, cognitive preparation. This is all about where the therapist works together with the client to identify anything that's a stressor. Which is quite similar to the way that normal cognitive behavioural therapy starts. And in this type of therapy, the therapist is very much not a I'm going to tell you what to do kind of therapist. It's more like I'm going to work with you to identify what you need. And so they'll work together to identify the things that are causing stress, and then seeing if there's any ways that they can change their thinking about those. So things, for example, if there's a massive stressor that seems really overwhelming, can they break it down into smaller bits to make it seem more manageable? That's changing the way in which someone is thinking about it, so it's cognitive. Equally, changing just the way, if someone's seeing a stressor as a threat, seeing them as a challenge, it might sound like you're just changing the word, but it's a different way of looking at it that can mean you're more likely to tackle them and to tackle an issue rather than seeing it as a threat and just getting stressed. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about it that helps you to be more positive about overcoming something. Right, skill acquisition. So this is the second phase, and in this phase, once you've identified with your therapist the different stresses that might be causing you to become very stressed, the therapist then has basically a toolkit of different techniques that they can use, and that will differ for every client. They'll decide which different techniques would be useful for a certain person. The only real exception to that is self-talk, which is where which is basically used with everyone because it's really useful, and you would learn a series of kind of what's called coping self-statements, things like, "You've got a plan, stick to it," and "You're in control here, so don't worry." It's basically kind of positive statements you can make to yourself which help you to cope with things. So most people will learn self-talk, and then there's this list here that I've put of these other skills that can be taught depending on what that particular person needs. So that's the cognitive element. The behavioural element then is where you practice the skills in the therapy. So you might do role play, you might talk to your therapist and kind of try and practice these techniques. For example, if you're doing social skills, try them out with your therapist. Visualize yourself in situations. So that's kind of the behavioural element. Can we put some of these things into practice within therapy before you then transfer it into the real world? Which leads us nicely on to phase 3, application and follow through, which is transferring it to the real world. And this will often go alongside that skill acquisition phase, where the therapist will set homeworks, such as it might be to do with some of these things where they've learnt social skills or relaxation techniques. It might be to have a go at employing a relaxation technique in a meeting when you feel stressed or something like that. And then the client would take those homeworks back to their therapy sessions and discuss them with their therapist. How did it go? Why didn't it go as well as you hoped? What were the barriers? And then perhaps try role playing again and seeing if you can tweak the technique at all or just practice it to get more confident. So that's part of it. And then another part of it is learning to cope with setbacks. So everyone as part of this will have setbacks where things go wrong. And so it's about learning, not being like, oh, I'm a failure, that's it, I can't do it, and giving up. So it's about developing resilience and developing strategies and learning that it's not just because there was bad luck or whatever. They have to kind of trust themselves that success is down to their own skills and not anything else, and that they must need to work at it. So there we are. Those are the 3 phases of stress inoculation training. And let's look at some strengths and weaknesses. So the strengths, so that there's evidence to show it's effective. So in your textbook on page 85, there's a really nice study outlined by Sheehy and Horan, who took first-year law students and they gave some students stress inoculation therapy and compared it to those who were on the waiting list for it, and found that the stress inoculation therapy was effective and reduced anxiety. And for those who were kind of at the bottom of the performance table, who were predicted to do really badly in their exams, it really improved their academic performance. So that's quite a nice study that tells you that it can be really effective. And then it's also really flexible. So if you think about that toolkit, not everyone will have every technique. It depends what each person needs. So that's a really nice element of it. You're less likely to kind of go along to the therapy and be like, oh, this isn't for me, because it's actually being made specifically relevant to you and to what suits you. It's also been adapted for online use, so that's another part of its flexibility, really. It means that it could be useful now in coronavirus lockdown when it might not otherwise be. Right, let's move on to looking at some weaknesses. So as you may have guessed, and you may be able to link some of these back to cognitive behavioural therapy when we looked at it, but a big weakness is that it needs lots of commitment and lots of motivation. If you think about some of the things that it requires you to do, to reflect about your stresses and your strengths and your weaknesses, and thinking about complex different ways of thinking, and you've got to be really motivated to go through all this and to try out these techniques. And for example, some of those coping self-statements, learning to say to yourself, you're in control here, so don't worry, well, that can feel quite cringy at first, can't it? But you have to, it's the sorts of techniques where you have to push through it and really try it to make an effort, and then it will work. So actually, in that sense, is not suitable for everyone. Not everyone is good at reflecting about their own self-skills. It kind of suits someone who's a bit more of a thinker than someone who perhaps has it requires you to have quite a good academic brain in some ways. It's quite complex and it involves lots of different things. So if you think about all the different techniques that are involved, we don't really know which things work. So you can give stress inoculation therapy as a whole to someone and test it against someone who hasn't had it. But it doesn't mean that all the techniques are working. It might be that it's just one specific thing within it that's really effective and everything else is useless. But because everyone does it differently, it's really hard to find out what's actually effective and what's not effective. So we don't really know, and it's perhaps unnecessarily complicated. So that is stress inoculation therapy.